This is a multi-part story, so if you haven't listened to part 1, I highly encourage you do that before listening to this. Isaac exploded with sensations as the gem's warmth radiated up his leg once more. The ethereal form in front of him glided over, sending shivers down his spine as she whispered, "I can feel it." Mesmerized, Isaac watched as ripples of light danced beneath her translucent skin. His heart pounding, he kneeled and ripped off his boot. The gem leapt from the compartment in his boot into his hand. Its vibrant red glow illuminated the nightmarish interior of their living vessel. Among the fleshy, dripping walls, Isaac saw something that defied his imagination. A door. It stood out like a large piece of driftwood on calm, open waters. Its planks were bright teal, trimmed in gold. A massive seafoam green starfish sat in its center. Isaac's mind reeled, torn between wonder and terror. He looked back at the floating form. He was captivated by her beauty, but was also stricken with a sense of fear. After the horrors he'd witnessed on the ship he was thrown from, paranoia gripped him. He clutched the gem and stumbled backward. "You can't have it!" he cried. Panic seized him as he slipped, but the form rushed forward, catching him with inhuman speed. Isaac's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared into her otherworldly eyes. "No one has it," she said. "You may hold it, but no one has it. That would be like possessing the sea itself, or the wind, or lightning." Isaac remained transfixed, lost in the flickering light of her gaze. "Perhaps this better suits you," she said as she helped him to his feet. Isaac watched as her translucent, illuminated skin turned solid. She transformed and stood before him as a human, clothed in a flowing purple dress adorned with many crystal shells and opal stones. Her eyes remained a reflection of her former form, glowing, vibrant teals and greens. What is this? Who are you?" Isaac stammered. "Come," she beckoned, walking toward the door. Isaac stood for a moment, considered his options, then followed her into the unknown. The woman's hand waved gracefully before the door, and the starfish began to spin like a mesmerizing kaleidoscope. As the door swung open, she stepped into inky blackness. Isaac again considered his options and followed her into the dark. He heard the woman whistle 3 descending, delicate tones. All at once, the chamber blazed to life. Isaac had expected to see the disturbing innards of a massive fish all around him, but he didn't. Gone were the grotesque innards of the fish, and he was surprised to find himself standing in a very cozy, welcoming room. Bioluminescent strands swayed overhead, pulsing with purple and teal lights. Several rugs sprawled across the hardwood floor, all with intricate designs depicting fish, whales, coral, and other various sea life. Sturdy wooden shelves lined the walls. Strange and mysterious relics sat upon them. An alchemy table sat in the corner, surrounded by ancient tomes and mysterious scrolls. There was a bed, a small stove, and other various pieces of furniture. At the room's heart sat a table, its legs writhing octopus tentacles frozen in wood. The woman moved to the table with inhuman speed and pulled out a chair for Isaac. "Please, sit," she urged. Isaac approached cautiously, drinking in the impossible sights. As he approached the offered seat, the woman glided to join him. "None of this makes sense," Isaac said. You've obviously got some kind of special powers. You gotta help me get back to Henry and my dad. You gotta help me save them." Isaac sat the heart of Gaia on the table. The woman's gaze was lost in its red, glowing light. "Sit," she repeated, looking up at him. Isaac shook his head and braced himself on the edge of the table. "I ain't sitting until you tell me what's going on," he said. "This goes far deeper than you can imagine, Isaac," she snapped. Her sudden change in tone startled him. Taking a calming breath, she softened her voice. "Please, sit. There's much to explain." Isaac sat, and the woman continued. "The heart of Gaia is no mere trinket," she said, her voice taking on an ancient quality. It's a fragment of the goddess herself, given to bring balance to the sea, Earth's most precious and volatile realm. Isaac leaned forward. She continued. For eons, my people, the Insone, safeguarded it and respected Gaia's intentions. With each passing tide, our harmony grew. We flourished from its light. It blessed us with abundance. There was once a beautiful balance, but power corrupts, and inevitably, the heart corrupted the weaker of us. Mistrust led to division. Division led to war. Eventually, many Insone were banished, and without the light of the heart, they were left to their own devices. Their souls became twisted as they tried to draw power from the very essence of the sea itself, siphoning its life force to strengthen their efforts in pursuit of the heart. They were transformed into dark nightmares, yearning for the light of the heart, its power. Those banished and doomed to darkness became known as the Absians. The heart has been pulled between us and them for what feels like an eternity. Isaac's blood ran cold as he remembered the monstrous crew. I've seen 'em, he whispered. These Absians. You've seen those cursed by them, she replied. The true Absians are far worse. Isaac looked away from her, confused. Then who are they? He asked. What do they want with the heart? What'll they do with Henry and my father? She reached out, clasping his trembling hands. Your father is their link to the heart, Isaac. They won't risk losing that. They need him alive. But your brother... Her voice trailed off, her expression grave. And my brother, Isaac asked, what of him? The woman looked down at the table, then back at Isaac. Her look gave Isaac his answer without need for words. He pulled his hands away from hers and stood up. Then let's go, he said. We've got the heart, the power. What are we waiting for? Turn this ship, this fish, around. The woman looked at him for a moment, then spoke calmly. We cannot risk the heart returning to the Absians again, Isaac. Once we return it to my people, I will help you save your father and brother, I promise. Your people? Isaac scoffed, anger building. Why should I trust them at all? Seems to me they want the heart just as much as the others. What makes them any different, huh? Who's to say they won't rip it from my hands and throw me into the mouth of an even bigger fish? We aren't like them, she insisted, a hint of desperation in her voice. Our intentions are... A deafening boom cut her off. The entire room quaked violently. Isaac braced himself on the table. Objects clattered from shelves as a deep, agonizing bellow resonated through the creature's body. The bioluminescent strands above flickered an ominous red. In a heartbeat, the woman shifted back to her ethereal form, gliding to the far end of the room. Isaac stumbled after her. What was that? He yelled. My father told me the heart doesn't want to be found by those with ill intentions, by those who would use it for dark things. The woman ignored him and had moved to look through something Isaac hadn't noticed before. It was a large black circle on the wall of the room. He stepped closer to her and realized that it was a window. A massive shape loomed in the distance, nearly invisible save for pulsing red lights along its flanks. Suddenly, a bright flame erupted before it, undulating in the impossible darkness. Isaac looked up at the woman, whose own light was reflecting off of the glass pane. No, she whispered, horror etched across her face. Isaac looked back out the window and watched as the flame intensified and shot toward them with terrifying speed. He barely had time to gasp before their sanctuary exploded in a maelstrom of wood, flesh, and icy seawater. Before they had time to process what was happening, the cold seawater filled the space all around them. As the room filled, Isaac took one last desperate breath, only to find he could still breathe underwater. His momentary relief vanished as he remembered. The gem! He spotted it, floating amidst the debris, but the current was already pulling him toward the gaping wound in their living vessel. Isaac clawed frantically at anything within reach, but it was futile. He was sucked out into the vast, unforgiving sea. There were more of the massive, red-lit creatures all around him. Their lights pulsed in eerie unison. Red, ominous flames in the darkness. Isaac looked back and saw the large fish he'd been traveling in, plummeting toward the ocean floor. It pulled its innards with it as it fell, like smoke billowing from a plane shot down in battle. The woman unleashed bolts of teal energy at the hostile vessels. They dissipated before they made contact on unseen force fields. The cacophony of her attacks mixed with the dying groans of their fallen vessel. Time seemed to slow, as Isaac spotted a familiar red glow sinking into the abyss. The heart of Gaia. Without thinking, he rocketed through the water with impossible speed, his hand outstretched. Isaac's fingers closed around the gem. A monstrous tentacle, pulsing with sickly red light, shot out from one of the Absian's ships. It coiled around Isaac's body with crushing force, and immediately, searing pain coursed through him. Every nerve ending screamed as electricity crackled across his skin. His vision blurred. Consciousness was slipping away, like sand through an hourglass. Yet even as darkness encroached, one thought burned bright in Isaac's mind. He couldn't let go of the heart of Gaia. With the last of his strength, Isaac made a desperate choice. He couldn't risk losing the gem. He couldn't let it fall into evil hands. There was only one place to hide it. Ignoring the agony racking his body, Isaac opened his mouth wide and swallowed the heart. As the gem slid down his throat, a burst of warmth spread through his chest. Then darkness took him. Isaac's return to consciousness was gradual and painful. Every inch of his body ached, and his throat felt raw, as if he'd swallowed fire. Slowly, he forced his eyes open, only to wish he hadn't. He found himself in a chamber of nightmares. Obsidian walls stretched upwards, disappearing into shadow. Rotten plant life grew over every inch of them. Sickly green flames danced in sconces, casting an eerie glow over everything. The air itself felt wrong, thick, oppressive, and tainted. It smelled of rot and decay. "Ah, our guest awakens!" The voice sent ice through Isaac's veins. His gaze snapped to its source, and his stomach lurched. Before him stood a dark and menacing figure. She might have once been beautiful, but now she was an abomination. Her skin was the pallid gray of a corpse, stretched taut over impossible angles. A tattered robe of deepest black clung to her emaciated frame. But it was her face that truly horrified Isaac. Where her eyes should have been, there were only dark, empty sockets, and from those sockets poured spiders. They skittered across her cheeks and down her neck, disappearing into the folds of her cloak. She smiled, revealing teeth filed to razor points. Green light pulsed behind them. "Welcome, Isaac," the creature purred, her voice like broken glass, wrapped in velvet. "Welcome to the last place you'll ever see." Isaac tried to move, only to find himself bound to a cold, stone altar. Panic clawed at his throat as the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him. The creature shuffled toward him across a floor littered with bones, her movements a grotesque dance. She drew a twisted black dagger from her cloak, and with the grace of an oversized spider, cut his shirt, exposing his glowing red abdomen. Isaac's heart raced. A chorus of hisses rose from the shadows, and Isaac noticed several dark hooded figures sitting around them. Eyes flickered, and tentacles flopped on the slippery stone floor. Isaac was too distracted by the witch in front of him to fully make out the details of the terrible monstrosities that surrounded him. He could feel energy from the gem pulsating through his body. Morphing fractals and patterns he had seen when first shown the gem mingled with the unfolding scene in front of him. A psychedelic nightmare he desperately wanted to wake from. The creature raised her twisted black dagger into the air, taking aim at Isaac's chest.
"Let us free the heart from your innards!"
she shrieked, her voice like nails on slate. Isaac strained against his chains as the witch's laughter filled the chamber. Droplets of vile green goo from her mouth spattered his skin as her cackles intensified. The surrounding abominations joined in a hellish chorus of hisses and groans. Time seemed to slow as the dagger plunged downward. But in the blink of an eye, it stopped, caught by Isaac's own hand. Only it wasn't his hand at all, but a writhing tentacle that coiled around the witch's bony wrist like a python strangling its prey. Isaac was startled and confused. Spiders jumped from the creature's eyes down his tentacle toward his face. Before they made it to him, a flash of red energy shot through his body, vaporizing the descending arachnids and searing the witch's flesh. The heat of the energy hit the creature, and she dropped the dagger.
"Ah!"
she howled.
"You little twit! I'll eat my way through your belly!"
Isaac watched in horror as her jaw unhinged like a serpent's, and her needle-sharp teeth elongated. With a surge of adrenaline, he pulled against his chains. They snapped like twine. He reached out with his tentacle arm and grabbed the dagger the witch had dropped. It pulsed in time with the gem hidden within him. Isaac leapt to his feet and slashed the air before him, a frantic warning to the monstrosities closing in. The witch hissed and snapped her jaws, recoiling at the sight of her glowing red dagger. The other dark figures in the room had gotten closer, and Isaac was able to make out more of their features. They were similar to the creatures he'd encountered on the ship, only more vile and grotesque. They too were fused with sea life, only much more rotten and decayed. To Isaac, they felt ancient, ripped from the roots of the earth itself, driven mad by their lust for the heart of Gaia. One of them, with an appendage that resembled that of mossy, rotten coral, hurled something at Isaac. He ducked, his newfound reflexes surprising even himself, narrowly avoiding the spiny black seashell. It shattered to pieces on the wall behind him. The snake witch lunged, jaws agape. Isaac thrust his dagger forward and slashed her face. Black goo oozed from the wound and sizzled as it hit the stone floor. With a desperate roll, he avoided the noxious liquid and sliced at her ankle. Tendons severed and more dark fluid gushed forth. He looked back through her legs and noticed something he hadn't seen before. A tall, black door. All Isaac knew was that it was the way out of the chamber, and that was good enough for him. He rushed to it, pulled one of the doors open, and went through. The door shuddered violently as nightmarish shrieks pierced the air. Isaac's heart raced as he frantically scanned the room for anything to barricade the entrance. To his relief, the door could be locked from the inside. He quickly pushed 2 large metal cylinders through loops mounted on the door and locked them in place. Just as he did, it began to shake and rattle. The creatures on the other side were pounding and scratching, howling and screaming. Breathing heavily, Isaac turned to survey his surroundings, and froze. He had entered some sort of torture chamber. A macabre collection of rusted spikes gleamed dully in the dim light. Chains rattled softly and wicked blades hung suspended from the ceiling. Then he saw something that stood out amongst the arcane devices. A large, floating black orb that seemed to devour the meager light around it. Drawn by an inexplicable urge, he touched it, and the darkness of the ebony surface rippled away, revealing what was inside. The woman who had saved him from plummeting into the ocean's abyss. She pounded silently against the orb's walls. Her mouth formed desperate words he couldn't hear. To Isaac, the woman looked like a glowing angel against a backdrop of unspeakable horrors. A firefly stuck inside a raindrop. Suddenly, the heat from the gem radiated up his back, down his arms, and into his hands. Isaac reached out and put both his palms against the sphere. The barrier hissed and bubbled beneath his touch, melting away like wax before a flame. The woman rushed to an archway on the far side of the room. There was a thick, black metal gate blocking the tunnel behind it. Rancid, murky water flowed through it and into a hole in the floor below her. Without hesitation, she began blasting the obstruction with bursts of cackling energy. A splintering crack rang out behind them. Isaac whirled to see monstrous spiders squeezing through fissures in the door, scuttling up the dank stone walls. "If you don't want to join the dead, help me cut through this," the woman yelled, her energy still assaulting the gate. Isaac heard the voice of the hissing creature on the other side of the door.
Lorelei, Lorelei, open up, it's time to die.
Isaac realized that amidst all the chaos that had unfolded, he and the woman had not introduced themselves. She seemed to know his name, but he had neglected to ask hers. Isaac's fingers found the hilt of his dagger. "I've got the heart, the power," he declared, surprised by the strength in his own voice. "I'll stand and fight." "There are many reasons that would be foolish, Isaac," Lorelei replied over her shoulder as she continued to blast the gate, "none of which I have time to explain." Swallowing his pride, Isaac tucked the dagger into his belt and returned to the gate. Again he felt the heat of the gem course through his body and into his hands. He pressed his palms against the cold metal, marveling as it began to glow red-hot, becoming as pliable as sun-warmed mud. A sensation he remembered from childhood, playing in a creek that ran behind his cottage with his brother. Just as they kicked the weakened gate forward, the door behind them exploded inward. A tsunami of writhing tentacles, snapping jaws, pinching claws, and glowing eyes flooded the chamber. Lorelei shot several energy blasts at the hanging lanterns in the chamber, sending them plummeting to the stones below. Flames leapt from them on impact, and their assailants were temporarily held back by a barrier of flames. "Come on," she yelled, rushing into the darkness of the tunnel. Isaac was close behind. The screams and cries of the creatures behind them echoed along the slimy brick walls. The light that emanated from Lorelei flitted down the tunnel, just as they did. Isaac made the mistake of looking back. The creature with the spider eyes, the witch, was right on his heels. She was hunched low to the ground, running on all fours, dashing up the sides of the walls around each turn of the tunnel. Her bottom jaw hung agape, dipping into the disgusting waters below as she ran. Tentacles were lashing out between her razor-sharp teeth, making their way toward Isaac. One of them quickly wrapped itself around his heel. Isaac yelled out, and Lorelei turned toward him. Her palm erupted with light that severed the appendage. The monster's shriek of pain reverberated through Isaac's bones as its blood sizzled on the stones below. Like a faint star on a moonless, cloudy night, they saw a light up ahead. Another tentacle came at Isaac. This time, he pulled the twisted dagger from his belt and hewn it in two. Again, the creature screamed. The scrambling of countless arachnid legs grew louder. Isaac's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, fixated on the growing bead of light in front of them. Then he spotted a round, metallic object affixed to the ceiling. "Lorelei!" he gasped and pointed. She saw it, and right as they passed beneath it, she shot at it several times. It rang like a gong, and the disc swung down like a pendulum of judgment. Isaac dove forward and felt a rush of air, barely avoiding decapitation, face first into the putrid water. A sickening thud and abrupt silence told him their pursuer hadn't been so lucky. He looked up and saw Lorelei staring behind him. With the light coming from the opening down the passage and the light from Lorelei, they could see what had happened. The object was designed to plug the tunnel for one reason or another. Lorelei had blasted it from its resting position, and it swung down on its hinges. As it did, it blocked the tunnel and sliced the head off the witch. The creature's body was on the other side of the metal plug, but her head sat in the water, gasping for air. Her spiders were crawling frantically back into her eye sockets. Isaac and Lorelei watched as her head howled and shriveled into a contorted mass in the water. They heard clanks and plunks on the other side of the plug as Lorelei helped Isaac to his feet. As they made their way toward the light again, the tunnel got shorter and more narrow. They hunched forward until they were almost crawling. The water below them was reduced to a trickle, and as the sounds of the creatures behind them faded into the distance, they began to hear an eerie melody drifting toward them. The sound of strings, both low and high in pitch, cut through the air. It mingled with the low drone of an accordion. The melody was melancholic but seemed to have a swing meant for formal dancing. They reached the end of the tunnel, and to their great relief, were not imprisoned behind another metal gate. They stepped forward slowly, not knowing what they might see beyond the tunnel's opening. Isaac peeked his head into the light, almost blinded by its contrast to the dark. His otherwise light brown hair was stained with the filth they'd been trudging through. Black was smeared across his face, and a bruise was starting to form around one of his eyes from a blow he didn't remember taking. The room they had arrived at was an enormous throne room. Although it held the same malice and sense of dread the other room had, it was opulent and far less marred by rot and decay. Black and silver lattice arched across the ceiling. Several chandeliers dangled from black chains. The flames on the candles that sat in them were like those from the ship Isaac and his family were trapped on, deep purple, outlined with solid white. They flickered on the ornate walls, which were covered in disturbing sculptures of creatures and scenes plucked from dark tales Isaac had heard many times. Dark green tapestries were draped on the walls as well, framing in other sculpted scenes. A long, dark burgundy carpet sprawled across the floor. It reached the far end of the room, where Isaac and Lorelei saw a small set of stone steps that led up to a throne. The backrest of the throne was a tall network of black, tangled branches. There were two plants that sat to the left and right of it. They were moving slowly, reaching up toward the branches, locking their outstretched veins of ivy into them. A red light flickered behind the throne between the gaps in the branches and ivy. And there, lounging on the twisted throne, sat a being that made Isaac's stomach churn. He wore a black crown of coral and shells. His face and body were elongated and malformed. He looked human in nature, but his limbs and features shifted in size and contorted as he moved. His large yellow eyes blinked rapidly and drooped on his face like a melting fish. Fins flapped open and closed around his neck as he chewed on bites of meat he sucked off a bone. Greasy white chunks of fat fell onto his black shirt and purple vest as he gnawed through pieces of meat with sharp teeth. Suddenly, he looked up from his snack and sniffed the air several times. He looked around the room. Nostrils flared, as if he were catching the scent of something that piqued his interest. He dropped the meat to the floor and stood up from his throne. Raising a hand, he silenced the group of musicians that were playing on the other side of the room. His body shifted and warped in unnatural ways as he moved forward down the steps.
"Don't be scared,"
he said, with a surprisingly sweet voice.
"No need to hide. You've nowhere to run and nothing to fear."
He reached his arms out, as if to welcome his unseen guests. Isaac fully stepped out of the tunnel, into the light of the chamber.
"Isaac!"
Lorelei whispered after him. Isaac walked across the long carpet, closer to the man. Lorelei followed.
"Ah,"
the king continued.
"I see our witch, Nyx, wasn't able to extract the gem from your stomach with her, well, let's just say, less than orthodox methods. Based on her lack of presence and your lack of death, I'd wager it's safe to say it's still deep in your guts, young man. It would also seem we find ourselves at an impasse. Would that be correct? No tools I possess can pull the heart from you, and the magic Nyx and her cohorts possess was not able to pull it from you either. It protects you. It's trapped inside of you, and it does no good for me there. You and your friend could fight me, and my gods, and half my kingdom, undoubtedly putting a rather large blemish on the beauty of my realm."
His eyes drooped again as he took a long breath. Isaac heard the king's bones scrape against one another as he bent to sit on the stone steps. His arms reached down to brace him as he placed his head between his knees and sat, leaning forward between them.
"However, I sense there is something you want," he continued. "Something you desire even more than the heart. Perhaps we can make a deal. Perhaps there is something you would ask of me in exchange for it."
The king leaned in and continued in a hushed tone.
"The heart gives you great strength to do great things. But you are like a fledgling attempting to fly. You may find its power doing you more harm than good, should you try to use it alone, and trust me, if you go with her," he nodded toward Lorelei, "you will be alone."
"Don't listen to him, Isaac," Lorelei shouted. "He'll deceive you and leave a dark pit of despair in his wake."
"Oh, and you trust this one?" the king asked. "This Insone? Her people are drunk off the power of the heart. Gaia gave it to no one, yet they claim it. They use it to power their cities and strengthen their people. They masquerade as noble keepers of the gem, all the while throwing their own people to the abyss, leading us to our demise. We merely sought to direct the light of the heart, to do more good for more of the earth. The Insone mean to keep it for themselves."
Lorelei exhaled deeply and asked Isaac, "Do you really think he or his people have the best interest of others in mind? After waking up in their dungeon, or they're being chased down their sewers by those things, do you really think they care about anything other than themselves? They want to use the heart's power to spread their darkness." Isaac felt as though he'd been dropped into one of the stories his father used to tell him on late nights. There were so many pieces of his story that he couldn't see, so many things he couldn't know. What he did know was that his father and brother were being held captive by people who were clearly villains in his story. He looked back up at the king and said, "There is something I want." The king's fiendish smile stretched across his face, and he whispered,
"Name it."
I really hope you're enjoying this fusion of horror and fantasy. I'm really enjoying writing it and diving into this universe. This is not the end of the story, not by a long shot. There will be at least one more part, probably 2 more parts. This may become my first 4-parter. If needed, may become 5 parts. We shall see. I'm not finished writing it yet, although I do know how the story ends, and I do know a fair amount of the pieces of the plot and pieces of everything. But I find, like, as I write these things I don't anticipate inevitably come up. These, like, tangents and these sort of nuggets of the story present themselves, and I like to explore those opportunities and explore those elements. There are several ways you can support the podcast, the first of which is leaving a rating or review on whatever podcast streaming platform you're listening to this on. That does go a very long way. Also, just telling your friends and family about the podcast really helps. I also have a Patreon at patreon.com/strangewhispers. That link will also be in the show notes. Over there, you get early access to episodes, some exclusive content, things like that. However you choose to support, thank you so much. I am infinitely grateful for you just listening and sharing this experience. I'm very excited to share the next piece of the story. And until then, keep creating.